Hello Internet, and welcome to this week's video, this time about the French and Indian Wars in North America. The French and Indian Wars was a part of the larger, almost global conflict. In fact, some historians have called it the first sort of real world war, the first thing that could be described as a real world war. Often considered to be fought between Britain and France. In fact, the real sort of conflict was between Prussia and Austria, and Britain and France just sort of fell into one of their, usual wars, because they were allied with the various sides and had the usual hostilities between them and disagreements and so on and so forth. However, it was fairly relevant inasmuch as it established a total British dominion of, what is later to become the United States of America and Canada, and thus laid the groundwork for, the world as we know it today. So I figured that would be interesting to talk about. So, yeah, enjoy. As I mentioned in the intro, the thing or the war that is called in North America the French and Indian War, at least in the United States, is the French and Indian War, was part of the overall 7 Years' War. And I probably need to talk a little bit about the 7 Years' War before we get down to business. The 7 Years' War was one of the 2 or 3 wars in the 18th century that sort of redefined the balance of power amongst the great powers of Europe following the death of Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. After his death, and with lesser leaders coming into power in France, and with the rise of Britain's monetary empire, and with the rise of Prussian militarism, the political landscape of Europe had changed quite a bit. It was no longer sort of a French hegemony with the empire struggling to keep up with them, and Britain and various other smaller forces trying to carve out a place for themselves. At this point, there were 4 almost equal great powers. There were Britain, there were France, there were the Holy Roman Empire, what was left of it, and there was the rise of Prussia under particularly Frederick the Great. In the 1740s, these 4 had fought the War of Austrian Succession, where Britain allied with the Empire and France allied with the Prussians, with both sides to a certain degree courting the rising power of Russia. Now, the War of Austrian Succession was basically about whether or not the daughter of the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire should be allowed to follow her father on the throne with a husband, despite the fact that Salic law that the empire was ruled by should have prevented such an occurrence. In the end, Maria Theresa did succeed her father, but the French and Prussian alliance allowed Prussia to conquer the province of Silesia and expand their own power, I should say, strongly against the forces of the empire, and in fact becoming a full kingdom in their own rights, while they had until that point really only been an electorate within the empire. Feeling that their alliance with Britain had not gotten them enough, Austria then changed sides and allied with the French. Britain, of course, could not allow themselves to be completely, left alone in Europe, so they assiduously courted the Prussians, who had, after all, shown themselves to have probably the most efficient and powerful army in Europe at the time, and eventually lured them over. And so we had a new position where former allies basically had traded places. For once for the first time in almost 1,000 years, the empire was allied with France, and now Britain was allied with Prussia. In 1756, this led to a new war as Frederick the Great again attempted to expand the power of Prussia, this time by taking the sovereign electorate of Saxony, while Austria really, really, really wanted to regain Silesia. So again, since Britain and France were well, their allies were getting into it, and Britain and France, of course, were always looking for an excuse to have a little scrap. Once again, we had a war. I'm not going to go into a long, detailed discussion about the 7 Years' War. Suffice to say that it was basically a very long, drawn-out stalemate in Europe that eventually ended with a kind of status quo antebellum peace. Russia was involved, then got out again, then got in again. Prussia won a lot, then lost a lot. Austrians eventually ran out of money. The French it was a mess. However, what it did do was that it allowed the French and the British to have a large scrap in the New World over who was to control the large colonial empires that had been forged over there. And it is this that Americans today know as the French and Indian Wars that we are going to have a talk about. So let's get on with it. The reason it's called the French and Indian Wars is, of course, that the English colonists were fighting with both France and their Indian allies. Now, the French in Canada and Louisiana, which they controlled at the time, were at a strong position of weakness. Well, that was a way to put it. Were in a position of weakness towards the British colonists. The French had a population of around maybe 60,000 people all over their colonies, while the British settler population in what was at this time almost the original 13 colonies had reached almost 2 million. So, as you can see, the French was quite heavily outnumbered, since neither side really had that many regular military forces over there, less than 1,000 from time to time. It was obvious to the French that even if they raised a powerful militia, the British would eventually overwhelm them. So what do? Well, we allied with the various Indian tribes, particularly the Wabanaki Confederacy and the, Algonquins, Lenape, Shawnee, Wyandots, various kind of Indian tribes, in order to improve our military standing, or rather the French military standing towards the British. The natives that the French allied with was perfectly happy to form this alliance. The French was not in any way a threat to their territories or way of life, as the now hastily expanding British colonies were. That doesn't mean, of course, that the Brits didn't have native allies, because, of course, if there was one thing the Indians were very happy about, it was to fight their own native enemies as much as to fight anyone from the outside. So the Cherokee, at least for a while, the Catawbas, and the whole Iroquois Confederacy was naturally on Great Britain's side to fight their ancient enemy. So, yeah, it looked to be a clusterfuck. Now, as always, France, and Britain had things to argue about, and like I said, they were only way too happy to join the war that was beginning in Europe. However, in the New World, it had really already happened for some time. While the 7 Years' War is nowadays officially sort of thought to be fought between 1756 and 1763, the war, or at least the state of war in America, had started already a couple of years before, in 1754, and in fact really ended already in 1760. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here, but it ended with a massive British victory. Well, we'll get to that anyway. The causes and sort of lead up to the wars were quite a few. Already in the 1740s, almost even before the War of Austrian Succession was over, the then Governor General of New France, which was today Eastern Canada, was deciding to expand into the Ohio Valley and put a sort of blocker in the way of British expansion from the old colonies by setting up fortresses along the Ohio River and in upper New York, and reaffirming their alliances with the native tribes while denying the British same alliances. So the French began to fairly aggressively set up a line of forts to block the British from, well, expanding, and also to protect themselves in case of British aggression. The British, of course, were not overly keen on this thing, so some of the local governors of the colonies also allowed various settlers to move west and start to get into the Ohio Valley. This led in 1752 to an attack by new French forces on a British trading post called Pickawilliany. The British there was annihilated by the French and their Indian allies, and this of course outraged the British authorities further east. Things got even more heated a few years later when the French under General Marin led almost their entire standing force of 2,000 Marines and militia troops down into the Ohio Valley to drive out various Indians that were opposing them, set up forts, and allow colonists to enter. The British, believing that they had the claim on the areas, sent a small delegation, not a military force, but a small delegation under George Washington, yes, the George Washington, who at the time was a 21-year-old major in the British Army, actually in the Virginia militia regiment, but let's not quibble, to tell the French to, well, please leave, because this is our territory and you don't really have a right to be there. The French disagreed. They felt that because Sieur de la Salle had been exploring the territories 100 years prior, they had the superior claim, and they said they weren't going anywhere. So Washington eventually returned home and made a report that the French have swept south, basically explaining exactly how they were not just surveying the area, but utterly fortifying the upper Ohio Valley in order to control it against British interests. The British, in their immediate imperialism phase, did not take this lightly, and the next 2 years were a sort of frenzy of fort building on either side, as both sides basically tried to, well, create forts to deny the other side various land grabs and, of course, prepare for a war that everyone in Europe and in the colonies by now knew to be inevitable. Some say that the war started in 1754 by the Battle of Jumonville Glen, even though it, of course, only began a few years later in Europe. Again, George Washington had led this time a bit larger force than his original, just negotiating party into the area to help a fellow named Trent to set up a fort. However, Trent was in retreat from a larger French force at the time. However, Washington allied with some native Indians under a Mingo Sachem Tanicreson, or however that is pronounced, and continued toward the French fortress of Fort Duquesne to once again meet with both Trent and the French. At this time, it was learned that a French scouting area was in the party, so Washington, uniting with the Indians, surprised and waylaid the Canadians on May 28, 1754, in what then became known as the Battle of Jumonville Glen. They killed most of the Canadian French forces, including their commander, Jumonville, whose death gave name to the battle, and forced the rest to retreat. At this time, this was the first time sort of open fighting had really occurred, and from this time on, even though it wasn't officially declared for another few years, a state of war could be said to exist in North America between the French and their native allies and the British and their native allies, ironically perhaps begun by George Washington leading a attack on the French. The rest of 1754 was spent in some low-grade fighting and harassment of each other's shipping and settlers here and there, but no real battles. However, in 1755, the local British militia forces and various governors were ready to take aggressive action. General Edward Braddock had arrived from Britain and had been put in place of a large expedition to take Fort Duquesne, the main French support position in the area. Also, various others, British forces under, for instance, Robert Monckton, who was to capture Fort Beausejour, and various other expeditions set off that year, but the primary one, as mentioned, was the one under General Edward Braddock with 1,500 army and provincial militia forces to take Fort Duquesne. He brought with him, again, George Washington as his aide-de-camp and as a guide, since Washington knew the area from his previous trips to that particular area. It was assumed that the British forces would sweep the numerically inferior French away from the area and regain British control of the Ohio River Valley. It instead turned into an embarrassing rout. The British was eventually ambushed by French and Indian forces, and using the Indian way of fighting, which was basically, guerrilla fighting in the forest and almost modern light infantry tactics, the French and Indians surrounded the the British shot from behind logs, ambushed them, and so on. Eventually, Braddock himself was killed, and 1,000 men out of his 1,500-man force was wiped out without achieving their goals. Washington and one of his later opponents during the the Revolutionary War, namely Thomas Gage, united to lead the retreat back into Virginia. All the other expeditions the British mounted that year was basically also disasters. Again, they practically always had numerical forces, but numerical superior forces, I should say. But logistical difficulties and bad planning and French will and their Indian allies' tactics and so on basically meant that almost every single one of the British attempts to take territory failed miserably. Basically, the only success was the one I mentioned earlier, namely Colonel Monckton, who captured Fort Beauséjour. However, in the end, the British basically just fought one battle to a bloody standstill around Lake St. George and then retreated to their own forces around and they retreated their own forces to an area between Fort Edwards and Fort William Henry, while the French remained in control of the areas they had taken over the last 3 or 4 years. Overall, it had not been a good year for the British colonists, and it was about to get worse. In 1756, the war began in Europe and was therefore officially declared, and it now became an official war zone in North America. This led to France sending regular troops under one of their better colonial generals, namely Major General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, and his second-in-command, Chevalier de Louis, to North America to bolster the militia troops that they already had in Canada, while the British, as of yet, could not really match the forces the French sent over. So the next year was basically the British playing very weak defensive, while the French went from strength to strength. They were attacking deep into the British fort lines in Upper New York and in the Ohio Valley. Amongst others, they conquered the British stronghold at Fort William Henry, and the French native allies basically, made a massacre of the British troops and settlers there. If anyone has read The Last Mohican, that is basically the plot of that book, namely the siege of Fort William Henry and its fall and the, demise and massacre of the people living there. Interestingly enough, while this was a major victory for the French and considered also, of course, a major victory for the Indian allies, the French did not like the massacre that occurred, and Montcalm would probably have stopped it had he had the ability, but the retreating British was basically ambushed outside of his immediate area of control. It might also have led to a very big problem for the Native Americans, because it is rumored that people even from the west of the Mississippi came to fight with the Indian allies of the French during the siege of William Henry, and there are some indications that they might have carried back smallpox to their native tribe lands way before it would otherwise have reached there, and of course led to mass death and extinction of several tribes, and basically left the area very, very weakened for later American expansion west of the river. However, this line of French victories changed in 1758. There was a incredibly poor harvest in New France in 1757, which led, of course, to military actions having to be somewhat curtailed as logistics and just manpower began to falter as the war developed in Europe. France could no longer deploy large regular forces in the North American theatre, and what was perhaps far more important, there was a change in government in Britain. The Duke of Newcastle had been Prime Minister in Britain at the beginning of the war, but following British losses both in North America and elsewhere, he was forced to enter into a alliance and a sort of coalition government with his old enemy William Pitt the Elder, in which Pitt was allowed to dominate the military planning while Newcastle dealt with domestic and economical issues. Pitt's strategy was to basically not use British forces in Europe at all, but rather pay large subsidies to Prussia to allow her to carry on the land war while using the forces of Hanover, which was in a sort of personal union with the British crown under King George III, to hold the French from threatening the Prussians from the west, and thus allowing the situation to develop there, while then using British forces, British regular forces, in the colonies to take over the various French areas around the world and cut them off from further supplies by the superior power of the Royal Navy. With this, he decided to relieve the British Supreme Commander in North America, Lord Ralph Abercrombie, of command, and replace him with two young up-and-coming generals, namely James Wolfe and the later Field Marshal Geoffrey Amherst. The arrival of British regular forces changed the picture completely in 1758. The now very powerful British forces allowed themselves to divide themselves into three different parts, leading three massive invasions of French-held territory. Geoffrey Amherst and John Forbes were to deal with a direct invasion of New France and to drive them out of Upper New York, while Sir Ralph Abercrombie, this was before his succession, was to lead almost 18,000 troops of regulars, militia, and Indian allies into the Ohio Valley to finally drive out the French from there. The first two expeditions was very successful. Amherst drove into New France and took the powerful fortress city of Louisbourg. General John Forbes, with 6,000 troops, retook Fort Duquesne in the upper Ohio River Valley and upper New York, and basically drove the French out of that area. However, the last link in the chain, the 18,000 men under Abercrombie's direct control, was in fact routed in an improbable French victory when about 3,500 Frenchmen at the Battle of Carillon defeated Abercrombie's major forces and forced them into sort of headlong flight. The only thing that basically saved the British cause at that time was the fact that a secondary movement on that particular invasion under a George Bradstreet managed to destroy the French fort Frontenac, including captures of major supplies. That meant that the French also, to a certain degree, had to withdraw from several fortresses within the Ohio Valley and retreat back towards New France, despite the British major loss. It was, of course, after this point that Pitt had had enough of Abercrombie and replaced him with Amherst in overall command of the North American theatre. Overall, 1758 had not been a good year for France. They had suffered several losses at sea, several losses in the European theatre, and now in the North American scene, it looked like the tide had turned. 1759 is overall known in British history as an Annus Mirabilis, a wonderful year or a miraculous year. It was a year where basically everything the British did on the battlefield had major success, and it was basically the year that, well, determined the fate of North America as a British rather than as a French-dominated continent. The British were now heavily outnumbering the French in forces and supplies and logistics, and even the French native allies had to a certain degree starting to desert them. Also, the British were now led by energetic and efficient young generals rather than the, less energetic Ralph Abercrombie. Amherst himself, the Supreme General of the North American Theater, led his forces into the Ohio River Valley to do what Abercrombie could not, and finally eject the French from there. He succeeded in capturing Fort Ticonderoga and basically annihilating the French forces in at the upper Ohio, and yes, driving them back out as originally planned. Meanwhile, James Wolfe led his forces in an attack upon the remaining French regular army under Montcalm at the New France capital of Quebec in the Battle of the Field of Abraham. A great British victory, despite the fact that both Wolfe and Montcalm was killed and Quebec was put under siege. At the same time, another British victory at Fort Niagara cut off the French frontier forts to the west and south, and with Amherst's capture of Fort Ticonderoga, the war was at that point basically over in the area of what would later become the United States. The French troops and settlers there either surrendered or managed to filter back into New France as best they were able. The French were now besieged in Quebec. Their forces in the Ohio Valley had been either destroyed or forced back, and at the sea, British supremacy was, basically undisputable. The French had really only one chance left, and that was to break the siege of Quebec by managing to get one last convoy of troops and supplies through the British blockade into the area. In 1760, they attempted that. The British suffered an attack outside Quebec City during the siege at the Battle of St. Foy, but the British fleet prevented the arrival of the French relief ships, and at that point, the final loss of Quebec was only a matter of time for the French. At the same time, the British put together yet another 3 armies entirely to advance on the last sort of real French stronghold of Montreal from 3 different sides. And eventually, the local French governor Vaudreuil realized that, the writing was on the wall, and negotiated a surrender to General Amherst in September of that year. Basically, they were allowed, the deal was that the French colonists could remain, of course, but that basically every one of the French troops would have to be pulled out, and Britain was thus, at least until the end of the war, in control of the old French-Canadian colonies of New France. At this point, the French and Indian Wars were basically over in a massive and incredibly successful British and American colonial victory. The war in Europe continued until its final negotiated stalemated peace in 1764, and again the war sort of officially continued in North America at the time, but there were fairly little happening. The French managed to capture the town of St. John's up in Newfoundland, but Amherst heard what had happened and immediately dispatched troops up there to regain control of the entire Newfoundland area. Most of the war in North America, if you can call it that, then basically shifted to Britain capturing territories from the French and their Spanish allies. Spain had joined the war in 1762 on the French side, fairly late, and in a moronic decision, by capturing their territories in Florida and in the Caribbean islands. But eventually in 1763-64, the war was over, and so, of course, were all hostilities in the North American theater. The French and Indian Wars had ended. Except it hadn't really, because out west, Amherst's conquest of the Ohio River Valley and his subsequent policies to sort of establish British dominion there had upset the remainders of the French Indian allies who had otherwise abandoned France. And under the chieftain Pontiac, they then began to attack Britain out there. So for 3 years, the French and Indian Wars were basically followed by what is today known as Pontiac's Rebellion, or Pontiac Wars, which was a series of serious attacks on frontier forts and settlements that lasted for nearly 3 years before the rebellion was defeated and the British were in firm control of the Ohio River Valley, with the Indians being pushed further out of their native lands or forced into a sort of sullen quietude under British dominant arms. What did this all mean? Well, it meant that that France basically lost every single colony they had held in the New World. They were able to keep on to 2 small islands, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, up around Newfoundland, that they actually still hold to this day, but the entire Canadian territories became British property. They also had to give up the Louisiana territory to the British. The British then also gained Florida from the Spanish, and although Louisiana and Florida would be traded back and forth between the major powers in years to come, what the war basically did was that it established the dominance of a sort of Anglo-American culture over the eastern United States, which would, of course, 20 years later, with the end of the American Revolution or the War of Independence, lead to American dominance eventually over the whole of, United States of America. Sorry, I don't know where that took me. And since I also mentioned the War of Independence, the Revolution, let me say that what the war also did was that while Pitt's war strategy was phenomenally successful in the war, it basically depended on taking out large loans in order to subsidize their allies and fight very far away from Britain itself, which meant that the British Crown were severely lacking money at the end of the war. Well, how do we raise money? Easy. We have these very rich colonies that seem to be doing very well, and we just fought a large war for them. Well, wouldn't it then be fair if we raised taxes on them to a very, very high degree? And so the Britain did, and of course, from 1763 and, 13 years later, we all know what happened. So, yeah. Might not have been the best idea in the end, Britain, although, of course, for the sake of the entire world, it might actually have been a very good thing that they thus decided to piss off the Americans enough that they realized they didn't actually need either the British nor their tea. And finally, of course, this war, combined with the American Revolution, of course, in the end, led to the destruction of the original Indian settlements, at least east of the Mississippi, and of course, eventually west of them. The now well-established British dominion of the entire Americas led to further settlements going west, despite George III's proclamation that the Blue Ridge Mountains was to be the western border of the British possessions in that part of the United States. Of course, after 1776, the colonists had absolutely no interest in following the edicts of poor old Georgie, so they immediately started pushing west. Then came Manifest Destiny, etc., etc., etc. Well, that's neither here or there. So overall, the French and Indian Wars are important because it allowed for the dominance of the North American continent by an Anglo-American culture rather than a French or a Spanish one. It established the military career of a certain George Washington, and it allowed a sort of a I don't know how to call it, a sort of pride in themselves from the British colonists that basically also allowed themselves to say, fuck you, Britain, we're standing for ourselves very few years later. France, of course, would then return to the North American continent by helping these upstart colonists against their great British oppressors during the War of Independence. As I said, anything to have a little scrap with England. But yeah, that was the French and Indian Wars. The British and Americans threw out France and established the hegemony over the North American continent that still reigns to this day. That was it. I hope you enjoyed that. Perhaps not necessarily one of my better videos. I felt I rambled a bit, but it is a very large subject. In order to sort of do the whole thing credit, there's a lot of things to talk about, and I might very well return to this particular subject again, dealing with more specific parts of it in the future. But for now, I can only say that I hope you find this interesting. I will probably talk about the 7 Years' War in Europe at one point, and if you find this interesting, please let me know in the comments if you want anything for me to talk about. But yeah, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.